just in relation to the question of sort of post-colonial discourse, I think it's sort of dangerous, I guess, to paint it all with one brush or something. But I think one element I would say that we can criticize it for, and I think it would be legitimate, is that often it takes for granted what the Eurocentric story is, right? So, for example, when you see texts criticizing Marxism, it's often assumed, and they use Marxism without adjectives, so it's not like geographically located or anything, but they're essentially, criticizing, for example, the Frankfurt School. And there is no attention, again, to sort of the global intellectual history of Marxism, which sort of, again, reproduces this narrative that Marxism is sort of like a Western project, even though, the history of Marxism in the second half of the 20th century is very much the history of, what they call today the global South, or what they called back then the Third World. Just like, you couldn't possibly write a history of Marxism in the 20th century without taking that into account. It would just not.
Which is a good time, I think, to ask you about, because before we got on the program, we were just chatting, and one of the things you mentioned is that your research includes work of this kind of theorizing that happened on the African continent. I sort of mentioned this in passing earlier. And a lot of it was taking place in Tanzania, right, in Dar es Salaam. Do you want to just say, given what you just said about the history of Marxism in the 20th century is kind of in the global South, can you just say a little bit about that?
Right. So one of the things I look at is the debate between proponents of African socialism in Tanzania under Nyerere, and African Marxists who sort of took an oppositional stance. I mean, it was a complex stance, not wholly oppositional to African socialism. But for example, in some of Nyerere's speeches, and Nyerere's thought is quite complex and develops over time. But in some of his speeches, he would speak of a traditional African society which was classless, therefore a theory that emphasizes class struggle as sort of like the vehicle for historical transformation is not relevant to that society. And you had people like Dan Nabuderi, who was from Uganda, Ugandan lawyer, political economist, and also like later on sort of more of a cultural theorist later in his life. And you had people like Abdurrahman Muhammad Babu from Zanzibar, who took sort of a critical stance towards this, and they tried to show, well, actually, this is sort of not really historically true. You had basically things that we can refer to as sort of tributary societies in some of those social formations that they were discussing. But more importantly, because this is where I think this sort of debate is relevant today, they ended up trying to understand, okay, how does this discourse of African socialism emerge? It emerges in Tanzania, it emerges in Senegal, Senghor as well. It also emerges, something similar emerges in North Africa, which was more like Arab socialism in Egypt, for example. And they try to analyze it as a kind of what they call a petty bourgeois discourse that seeks to sort of obfuscate internal class struggles and subsumes them in the name of a kind of national struggle. And obviously the relationship between sort of internal class struggles and the periphery, if you want to call it, or the neo-colonies as they were called in those debates, and a kind of national liberation project is complex. And I think similar debates would be fruitful today. This is why I think this stuff is relevant, and this is why I bring it up. So I don't want to speak too long, so I'll stop here, see if you have any follow-up questions.
I suppose my follow-up is, what is it meant for Marxism generally to have lost those thinkers? I mean, so there's a generation of thinkers which are operating around the mid-20th century period. They're in Dar es Salaam and they're debating. And then there's another generation that follows on from that includes, figures like Samir Amin, who also wrote on tributary modes of production, world systems theory, and so on. And that generation is slowly starting to disappear. Unfortunately, most of them are aging and they're passing away. And it seems like we've reached a kind of a vacuum in an intellectual vacuum that is sort of unable to kind of to give us the tools that we need to continue thinking critically about the historical moment. So what do you think the loss of these African Marxists, as our viewers in the comments have wonderfully been reminding us, existed in abundance? What is it meant to have lost them, not only tragically when they pass away, but a lot of them also kind of, as happened in South Africa, migrating into government, overseeing a neoliberal program in after independence. What has that meant for Marxism?
Yes, so I mean, it's definitely. I think the biggest problem is we haven't had, like you said, maybe the chains of transmission have been broken, and I think this is one of the biggest issues. And I think this is why it's very important to sort of bring attention to these texts the way sort of we're doing today, and maybe there's a possibility we can like post a bibliography or something. I think that would be because also the texts are mostly out of print, very difficult to find. So if you find them, it's sort of by chance, really. But I think one important thing is for us to at least go back and study these things. And we're not saying okay, people must be Marxists and sort of like dive into these debates, but at least know what you're rejecting. If you're saying, okay, well, Marxism is this Eurocentric thing, at least sort of like look at the history of Marxism in these places and these debates. So at least you have, some kind of understanding of the thing you're rebelling against. And I think that's I think what we should at least try to do. And not just because it's often, it's very interesting that a lot of the characterizations of Marx as Eurocentric, they also come from universities in the West, which is interesting. I mean, that like from the standpoint of the sociology of knowledge is an interesting phenomenon, but, we can go into that later, I guess.
That's absolutely true. I was going to add just one more thing, and it was really interesting when you were kind of talking about Marxist position of not simply kind of refuting the notion of this classless society that exists prior to colonization, this like weird thing that we have to in some way resurrect. It's a strangely conservative logic, but also asking the question of why this is coming to prominence at this particular juncture. And so I am of the opinion, in a very bold claim I'm about to make, that we have to kind of turn it away from the external forces which are affecting us and the kind of broader structure, but also the people who are attacking the left and Marxists. There's a sustained attack on the tradition of Black Marxism. But to think more inwardly or be more reflective, I would say that we have not done such a great job at narrating our defeat and having that story of what precisely has changed. If as Marxists we say that like the social world produces the way that we conceive of the social world, and then in turn we kind of act on that world to make history, then that big first question is really important for us to answer. And I think that all too often our stories become about these heroes who we tragically lost. We seek out individuals who, like, if only we went back and fought a bit harder using this program, if only we like didn't lose this person at this moment, as opposed to the kind of collective mass political histories that are required to be able to understand, well, why was it in the 1970s that like Marxism was the winning position? Why did it feel like people were on the eve of revolution? And why did that change? I don't think the assassination of one Black Marxist can change the hearts and minds of millions of people across the global South, right? And so something deeper has to be happening. I think that's the thing we have to contend with.